appreciate this. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who's come out for this event and who's organized it. I really do appreciate it.
Now I see it's now streaming live on Facebook. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so once again, greetings everyone. And first of all, a huge congratulations to Judith on the publication of her 4th book, How to Drag a Body and Other Safety Tips You Hope Never Need, which she will hold up periodically as I'm speaking. This book is now out, and we're posting a link to the books page on Judith's website where you can order it. There are a variety of ways to order it. That'll be in the chat bar. Ordinarily, we'd have you line up to get your copy signed after the event, but in this case, if you purchase the book and want a signed book plate, you can email Judith and she'll arrange to send it to you. Her email address, judith@judithmatloff.com, will also be in the chat room, in the chat bar. So just as I mentioned before, this other bit of housekeeping, which is that you'll all be on mute during the talk. So please post your questions in the chat bar. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, we'll do our best to capture your questions there as well. After the Q&A, we'll unmute everyone who's on Zoom. We can't do anything about Facebook Live, to give you a chance to say hi. So it is a real treat to have 2 Hunter alums, 2 journalists in conversation this evening, Judith Matloff and Sewell Chan. Judith and Sewell not only share the Hunter experience, separated by a few years, and the 2 attended Harvard, but both also made a lasting impression on their teachers, in at least one case, the same teacher. Sue Leung Eichler, our fabulous social studies teacher, remembers both Judith and Sewell clearly. Sue, she says we should call her Sue now, writes, "They were both uniquely different students, but equally brilliant and interesting. Judith was one of the many talented students in a lively class that I had towards the end of the school day. Judith was a philosophical and dynamic student who not only answered questions with incredible clarity and focus, but enhanced discussions with questions of her own. She was inquisitive and always wanted to know more and to know why and how. Energy and passion would often emanate from her when she spoke, and her curly blondish hair, sometimes covering part of her face, would bob up and down. What an amazing 8th grader she was."
Woo.
Sue continues.
I'm amazed she remembers.
Very clearly. Sue continues. Sewell exuded a quiet and passionate intelligence. He was perceptive and analytical in his evaluation of ideas and historical events. He often viewed readings from his own unique perspective, giving classmates something to chew on. He was thoughtful in his responses and was always respectful in any disagreement he would have with classmates. She writes, "I used to believe that I could see his brain twirling with ideas as he attempted to articulate them as fast as he could before another set of thoughts was created. His research papers were equally impressive in their sharp analysis and lucid writing." Now, one might expect that Sue was speaking about Sewell as a high school junior or senior, but she believes that she was his teacher early on, probably in 7th grade.
Wow.
So, Sewell and Judith both did Miss Sue, proud. Judith now teaches crisis reporting at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. As a journalist for over 40 years, she's covered top international stories, including Rwanda's genocide, apartheid, and the rise of Vladimir Putin. She trailblazed safety training for women and media organizations around the world, pioneering protocols for digital, gender, and physical security. She consults for leading organizations internationally. Earlier in her career, Judith headed the Moscow and Africa bureaus of the Christian Science Monitor, and she spent a decade reporting for Reuters from various countries. For those of us who went to Hunter with Judith, none of her amazing career comes as a surprise. We all thought of her as a trailblazer, even back then. It was kind of cool when Judith began studying the sitar back in high school. Helen Feingold Friedman, our beloved music teacher, still remembers Judith sitting on Helen's desk in her classroom playing the sitar for everyone. But Judith didn't just take sitar lessons. Somehow, at age 15 or 16, Judith arranged to travel to India for the summer to study with one of the most accomplished sitar players in the world. So, though we continue to be wowed by her, those of us who knew Judith back when expect nothing less. Sewell, who graduated just a few years later in 1994, is another one of those Hunter alums in whom we take great pride. Sewell joined the LA Times in 2018 as a deputy managing editor, where his responsibilities were dizzying and his accomplishments impressive. In April, he took on the role of editorial page editor. And before joining that Times, he worked at the New York Times for 14 years, where he was a Metro reporter, Washington correspondent, deputy op-ed editor, and international news editor. We're so fortunate to have both Sewell and Judith here to discuss Judith's new book. But first, Judith is going to pick one lucky winner of an autographed copy of How to Drag a Body. And good luck, everyone, and enjoy the conversation.
Okay, do we have a drum roll? Okay.
And I'm going to mute myself.
It is. The winner is Sloan Elman 73. Here we go. Sloan Elman 73. Congratulations, Sloan. There we go.
Well, thank you. Congratulations, Sloan. First of all, thank you so much to Anne for your leadership, to Eniko for bringing us together, and to all of you Hunter alums for coming together on this busy evening. I really have been looking forward to this my whole week, really. Hunter remains the most important alumni community I've ever been a part of. I'm so honored that my dear friend of more than 30 years and my co-term council, co-president, Zoe Cohen, is on this call. Also very happy to see women I've admired for so long, Martha Hodes, Deborah Tannen on this call. I'm just feeling like goosebumps just thinking about this hour ahead. I'm also deeply touched, Anne, and I hope I will reach out to Mrs. Eichler afterwards. I just am so startled and really like blown away that she remembered me. I actually had her for 2 years in both 7th grade and 8th grade. She was such a tough, demanding, rigorous, curiosity-provoking teacher. I'm a little bit verklempt. I mean, she influenced my life from 1988 to 1990. And I think about 30 years, since, about the things that I learned in her class about China, about sub-Saharan Africa. I was a kid from Queens. I had never been to these places. It's just very, very moving to hear that. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to thank Mrs. Eichler as well. I'm glad she's doing well. Judith, I first encountered your work when I read your book, Homegirl, which talked about, it's a fabulous read. No spoiler alerts here, but it is really an incredible book that is about you and about life and about Harlem and about home and about a sense of place. I just really commend it to everybody. So when I was asked to moderate this talk, I just thought, wow, what a treat. I have to say that this book, which is entitled How to Drag a Body and Other Safety Tips You Hope to Never Need, Survival Tricks for Hacking Hurricanes and Hazards Life Might Throw at You. This might be the timeliest book publication ever. And I have to admit, I read this book, kind of wondering how, it would tackle the subject matter, which in many cases is deadly serious. And it is actually the most, dare I say, fun book about disaster preparedness that I have ever read.
Good.
And so in addition to starting to ask you about the timing, before we get to even the timing, Judith, what prompted you to write this book?
I have been doing safety training since 2005 for journalists who cover emergencies, crises, wars. And what I have been finding over the years is that ordinary people, my neighbors, my cousin Jeff, who's a lawyer, the guy across the street who's the super, they've been asking me for safety tips about, should my kid carry a knife on the subway? Half of my family is Puerto Rican, should we be going down there? Zika looks like a problem. How do we prepare for what looks like a terrible hurricane this season? So I was fielding all these queries. And at one point, I began to think maybe I should just put this in a book. That way I can just hand people the book and say, here are all the answers. And also I felt that this information shouldn't be restricted to my colleagues, our colleagues who are journalists, that this is stuff that could be useful for ordinary people. So that's how it came about. And I wrote it really quickly. It just took 6 months because so much of the book is based on the lectures that I give and the training that I do all over the world. So it was simply a matter of sitting down and, you know, writing it all up and putting it together. So it's probably the quickest book I've ever written. The last one took 8 years. This one took far less.
I think the book's writing kind of evinces a certain, not only presence of mind, but again, it's kind of a delightful book to read. It just has humor and it has a sense of perspective. And I'm curious about whether or not you've always brought those traits to the tough situations that you have, that you've covered. You know, did you have that sense of kind of, you know, inner fortitude even at Hunter? What does it date back to?
I don't know, my colleagues here, my classmates can tell you, my dad was immensely funny. Anybody who knew Larry Matloff know. My father was just an immensely funny man. And I think that that got infused into my sister Susan, who's also Hunterite, and myself. But in terms of, you know, when you're in really tough situations, humor helps you get through them. And if you can see the absurd of a horrifying situation, you're conquering the dread. You're not letting it get the better of you. So I think I've always turned to gallows humor and whatnot. And in terms of my teaching, one of my mentors, he's the head of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, Bruce Shapiro, who sends his very best to you. Bruce has seen my lectures because I do training for him. And he said, Judith, just write it the way you talk. And I, you know, if you lecture on really, really grim stuff and there's no levity, you're going to lose your people. You have to keep up. Teaching is a performance, and so humor is one of the tools I've always incorporated. And so again, I took Bruce's advice. He said, just write it the way you talk. Just basically pretend that you're standing in front of a room. And that's how I adopted it. And then my decision, I don't know if you can see on the cover, there's this extraordinary cartoon. I love, as a journalist, I love working with photographers. I just think when you're working with visual people, you see things in a different way. So I've always loved to collaborate with them. I couldn't use a photographer for this because they'd be like really awful, bloody pictures. But I thought, why not work with a cartoonist who could also capture that whimsy? And I thought, well, I really love the New Yorker. That's sort of the style that I want. So I just reached out to this one woman, Sharon Levy, just out of the blue, and within 3 seconds she got back to me and she said, I'm in. Like, when do we begin? And you know, I've never actually met her in person, but we had such a great creative connection. She's from LA, by the way. And you know, I would just email her and I'd say, for that picture of the bunker, can we stick a llama in there? And then the llama would come back at me and he would have like the perfect look on his face. So we just had this terrific collaboration. I just want to say one more thing about the picture. It's horrifically, but yet delightfully prescient. She did this picture before, I don't know if you can see it well. It's of a woman calmly drinking coffee with a gas mask on over the skyscrapers of New York, while what looks like a meteor, but it looks like a coronavirus, but it's actually a meteor, is about to crash. She came up with this about 6 months ago. Like, we had never even heard of the COVID-19. And so there was something so spookily prescient that we had chosen this as the cover. We had no idea what was going to happen. So there you go.
You, at the beginning of your book, you talk about the need for kind of what you call planful problem solving. Could you explain this concept a little bit? And I want to preface this by saying that, you know, I think this crisis has really exposed so much. We could spend hours talking just about the pandemic. We could talk about resilience, our own resilience personally, and our resilience as a society. We could talk about the planning of our institutions. But why is the importance of personal kind of planning important?
Well, it gives you control. If you're in a crisis, as we all have been the past few months, there's a sense that the world is coming apart and we can't control it. But if you plan for the worst case scenario that you can imagine, you allow yourself to go there mentally, and then you start to backtrack and you try to think about how you can mitigate the eventuality of that and how you can cope. And then you come up with a plan, you actually feel incredibly in control. And I think we all do this on a lot of levels without realizing it. Every time we take out an insurance policy, prenups, Every time, you know, if you're a doctor, you're looking at the worst case scenarios. This is something lawyers do. But if you can actually do it in terms of the risks that one might face in your life, it really gives you a great sense of control. And I'll give you an example. My husband and I, because we've been foreign correspondents for so long, and we lived in crisis areas such as the former Soviet Union and Africa, we would always plan for really terrible things because they usually happened. So when this crisis began in early mid-March, I was upstate in a writer's residency. My husband was in Europe. Our son was in LA. So none of us were on base to do all that shopping, to get the wipes, to get the masks, to get the gloves. But we already had it at home. We'd already stocked up all these provisions. So we all calmly flew back or drove back into New York, and we didn't have to do that crazy scramble, the hoarding and everything, because we'd already done it. We'd already stockpiled about a month's supply of beans and tuna and lentils and, you know, all that stuff. So I do think that Planful, you know, it's very, very careful planning makes life a calmer experience.
How do you get people into the planning mindset when thinking about the worst case scenario can frankly be terrifying? I mean,
Yeah.
Just full confession, I'm a New York kid. I moved out to LA. I was listening to this KPCC podcast about the big one, about what happens.
That's a great podcast. Yeah.
What happens if, you know, really the mother of all earthquakes were to strike Los Angeles? I have to be honest, after the first episode, I couldn't bear to hear anymore. I know I should listen to the rest of it. I know I need to get my earthquake kit ready. I know that intellectually, but emotionally, it was hard for me to kind of continue. And how should we as your readers help overcome that hurdle?
Well, that was one reason, getting back to your question, why I decided to take a lighthearted tone, because I thought it would be less scary that way. If I stand here and I preach and I say, you know, you should stockpile a month's worth of lentils, you're not going to appreciate it. But if I do it in a very whimsical way, it's going to be more accessible and it will seem less scary. The other thing is, you didn't have to listen to the whole podcast because it was pretty apocalyptic, but do you have one of those emergency kits? That's all you need.
I do now because I joined KPCC as a member.
Okay. Okay, I'll give you a lecture later. But again, you know, if you can just go there and make the preparations, then it's less scary. If you just go there, but then you don't do anything about it, it increases the anxiety. So, you know, my line with people is just do it. Just come up with a plan and actually do something concrete, because it will make you feel more in control.
Judith, one of the many themes in your book, which is quite complex and a really, really fascinating read. And it's kind of, it's not explicitly mentioned in the title, but in many ways, I think this book, gender is a theme in this book.
Oh, totally.
I think, you know, we've all become much more attuned, one hopes, to issues not only surrounding violence against women and gender-based violence, but also around, you know, new sorts of threats, in particular, the harassment and abuse that women online tend to face much more than men do. I'm curious for a moment, you know, can you bring us back a little bit to when you were starting your career?
Yeah.
You know, foreign correspondence, you know, traditionally, it was a very male-dominated field. I think even now, sadly, decades later, it's often, when you think about people sent out to cover natural disasters, calamities, or armed conflict, you know, it is changing, but historically, that was a male-dominated field, even within the generally male-dominated field of journalism. Tell us a little bit about how your early experiences informed your lens on gender and the writing of this book.
Okay, I'm just going to take 1 second to get something for show and tell that might be able to tell the story better than anything else. Just hold tight. This is a bulletproof vest. This is what you wear when you're in combat. My boss gave me a red one to make fun of me. Everybody else in the office had a blue one. And this actually could in some ways put me in danger because it makes me a target because it's so red. You know, to me, this so articulately sums up what the problem was, that I was the only woman in the office covering conflict, and it was seen as a joke by my boss. that, you know, he would think, nobody wears a red flag jacket. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, you know, you'll see camouflage, you'll see blue and black. You don't see people wearing red ones. Definitely when I started out reporting in the early 80s, I would have a boss I had one boss that followed me into a bathroom in a restaurant, hoping to have sex with me in the next stall. And he didn't understand why maybe this was inappropriate. I had people commenting on my figure, asking me who I was sleeping with. Oftentimes I would be the only woman in the room or at the bar, you know, there'd be 20 guys and just me. And I think this is where I really developed my sense of humor, because without it, I would have been in a constant rage. It was really, really challenging then, but I do think it's easier for women now, and I think there is a discussion right now, certainly with the Me Too movement and whatnot. So I am really heartened that the women that I'm training now, who are substantially younger than me, are getting tools to deal with this. But when I started out, you know, if you're the only chick in the office and they're giving you a red flak jacket, there really is no discussion. You kind of power through it. So I really am so happy for the younger women today, because I think it is easier. It was a very, very macho, really, I think, oppressive kind of environment then. But then, like anything, you just kind of, you deal with it and you plunge on. And so in my teaching, there's a very small cadre of us that do safety training in the journalism industry. And around around 2008, I started incorporating gender safety into my training. And I really was the very first there. And it's interesting, I would say at my training courses, the vast majority of the people who take it are women, because I really am one of the very few women trainers doing this. And they need to hear stuff from a woman, and I think they trust it more. So it's become a niche within the training industry. And it's important. It's really, really important. And I'm glad you raised it.
Tell us a little bit about, how you treat the subject of violence in the book. I think that's a topic that's on a lot of folks' minds, and it's a different kind of trauma and danger than that posed by disease or natural disaster. Could you tell us about tell me about how you approach those chapters in your book?
Do you mean the riot chapter, or do you mean the resilience one, which deals with PTSD?
Both, actually, yeah. But the one particularly thinking about rioting, unrest.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge issue that I think we all, not just journalists, but regular civilians, are going to be facing post-COVID, which is, I think we're going to see an explosion of civil unrest. We're already seeing it in anti-lockdown protests, and I think it may, we're seeing people showing up at these protests with AR-15s and even RPGs, rocket propelled grenade launchers, and I think it's something that I think every citizen, not just a journalist, needs to know how to navigate a violent protest, because I think we're going to be seeing more of them. I'm also very, very concerned about school shootings and mass shootings, and again, I think any tools that people can have to be able to cope with these eventualities, which is what they are. So that chapter is fairly specific. It's very tactical. It's about, these are things you can do to keep yourself safe. Even if it's, there's a stampede, people are rushing away from violence and you get caught in it. I tell people how to stand properly. I tell people how to identify pipe bombs, and really how to talk to your kids about violence, because I think that's also a very big problem. But, one chapter that's a corollary to that is the one on emotional resilience, which recently, certainly with the COVID crisis, people have told me has been a very, very useful chapter. But I think also after a very violent event, even a car crash, there is a huge amount of stress that one is trying to process. And so I felt that I needed to give a counterweight, not only with the tactical issues of how do you deal with violence when it's unfolding in front of you, but also what you do in the aftermath and what you can do to process it. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
yeah, and just to ask a little bit more, I feel did you ever worry about the risk of not normalizing the violence, but you're writing very explicitly about how to deal with terrible situations that, frankly, most of us hope we will never be in. Right. And I wondered, and yet a planful, rational approach is one that sort of requires us to think ahead about what the possibilities might be. And I'm just wondering how you to do that in a way that is not alarming to people.
Well, again, I think that's where the humor came in. And with the publisher, we spoke a lot about tone. And there were certain points when she said, Judith, you just have to pull back. Like, you're being too Judith here. And the rape, the sexual assault and sexual harassment chapter went through about 7 drafts. We really, really felt that one had to be treated very, very delicately. And that one, the publisher actually, who was my editor, we went through every paragraph just to make sure that the tone was appropriate. Yeah, I mean, it all gets down to who your intended audience is. And again, the title of the book is Safety Tips That You Hope to Never Need. But I felt that we needed to cover all these topics because you may face them just like whoever thought we'd face a pandemic. So I felt we needed to deal with it. And again, the humor was one way that I felt could make it more palatable. But you're the reader. You can tell me whether you think it is the right way to do it or not.
There's been a move in that the movement you've been part of journalism safety and training has been hugely growing. I think you're so right that there's still not nearly enough of it outside of organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists and the DART Center Autism and Trauma. There don't the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. There are a few, but there aren't that many kind of entities that are either training journalists for dangerous situations, or on the other end of it, helping them to deal with issues like PTSD, which I don't think journalists used to commonly talk about.
No, we never did. Never.
Do you agree with that assessment? And
totally.
And how do you think that shift?
There are far too few of us, and we're far too under-resourced. And I was just talking with Jim Foley's mother, who's a good friend. He's one of the American hostages. He was the first who was beheaded by ISIS. And I was talking with her yesterday, and one thing that Diane is very worried about is that in this current climate where there is financial collapse amongst many sectors, she won't be able to get the funding to continue the work that she does in terms of training journalists and trying to give aid to hostage families. And it remains to be seen whether the resources can be found to continue our work, because we really, we're all nonprofits and we rely on nonprofit money to do this kind of work. But what I am heartened by, and the 2 organizations that you've worked for, that there is a culture of safety awareness, which there certainly wasn't anywhere in the industry before, but the New York Times, LA Times are very much out there. And I think the larger organizations can afford to do it and have those resources where they can do it. But it's the freelancers, it's the small local newspapers, it's the small radio stations that I worry about the most.
What is your top advice when you're talking to young people, especially young women, about dealing with online harassment and trolling? I feel this is like an issue that's absolutely not going away. The amount of misinformation, the kind of toxicity, the difficulty in whether and how to regulate the giant social media platforms, and what we know about how rapidly, either falsehoods or abuse can spread, often unchecked. How do you address that landscape when you're in the classes that you teach?
It's in a way, it's one of the most obvious lectures, and it's also one of the most difficult to teach because it's very, very technical. A lot of it deals with how you can build technical digital protections around yourself. And to be quite honest, that was actually one of the most difficult chapters to write because I'm taking highly technical information and I'm trying to unpack it in a way that's accessible. Because, and it is the most abstract part of the teaching, when you're telling people to encrypt, when you're telling them to dogpile, when you're telling them to do all sorts of different things, to use what can be very, very complicated apps and programs. But there are the 2 main takeaways that we that we reiterate over and over again to women, but also to everybody else, is that you've got to separate the personal from the professional when it comes to your digital communications. Because when they get to you on the personal level, when they start doxing you, when they get to your family, that's when it really begins to get very, very pernicious. And so what you need to do is separate the two as best as possible. The other thing, you've got to build up allies, and you've got to get people to, if you can, to curate and read the comments so that you don't have to. You need some kind of buffer and filter between you and the nastiness that's coming out. I will say that the social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook have largely not been effective when journalists and ordinary people have tried to get their help to block comments. They have not been helpful at all. So unfortunately, it becomes incumbent on us to build up our own protections. You know, again, I put as many tips as I can into this in the hopes that people will use it as a guide, and they can avail themselves of the different tools that are out there to try to protect themselves. But, you know, it's a huge problem. Digital harassment particularly affects women. And we're seeing a huge amount of, I don't know if you're seeing it at the LA Times, but we're seeing a huge amount of it generally in the industry. What I'm hearing about, just the piling on journalists during the whole polarization about the pandemic has been really vicious, really vicious. And I unfortunately, I don't see it getting better.
We have Hunterites of all different generations and experiences on this call. I mean, would you advise someone who's not currently on social media to start? No. I wasn't on Twitter until a month ago, and my publisher said you have to go on it. I'm actually really fascinated by it. I mean, one reason I didn't want to be on is I'm like so ADHD that I know it's going to be pulled into this vortex. But just from a safety point of view, I think social media opens you up to a lot of, it exposes you further to harassment, to dangers, to hacking, whatever. So unless if you actually absolutely need it for your social life or your professional life, I would say minimize your exposure on social media if you can. Having said that, you know, Zoom has been a lifesaver for all of us. And it's interesting the way that has evolved, because when we all started out using Zoom about 2 months ago, people were Zoom bombed. You know, there were a lot of privacy and hacking issues. But I think you know, that has evolved too. People have learned those tools, and that's another reason why we need to know what tools are accessible so we can insulate ourselves from, you know, the outside. To go back for a moment to the issue of kind of sexual harassment, had you already started the book at the time that the Me Too movement really gained force in the fall of 2017?
No, I hadn't, but I was so aware of it within our own industry, of just the gigantic harassment that people faced. And, you know, as I'm saying, you know, dating back to the 80s when I first started, when it was just an accepted part of the job. So no, it wasn't at all. It wasn't what pushed me to write the chapter, because already since 2008, I was already doing training in that area. Yeah, and I will continue to do training in that area, unfortunately. I think there's going to always be a need for it.
One of the closing chapters in your book is about resilience, and I really want to go back to that concept. I mean, how should we think about resilience? I think a lot of folks are thinking about it at the level of you know, our individuals and our families, but you know, how do we increase our kind of societal capacity for resilience? I think there's a feeling right now, you know, and I would hope that it's strong, especially I would think it's very strong, especially among the hunter community, because we learned a lot about critical thinking and about use of evidence and about making rational arguments and about, you know, proceeding from logic and about research while we were at Hunter. And unfortunately, this seems to be, there are elements in this age that seem to be anti-knowledge, anti-science, and sometimes even anti-reason itself. And so I'm curious about, you know, how we build up, what you think, how we build up resilience in an age of volatility and unreason?
Well, it's so interesting because I literally just got off the phone with 3 disaster psychologists who are leading people in the trauma field. And I'm thinking of putting together an op-ed or an essay about exactly that question of how you build collective resilience. And the messaging that they all brought was, yes, you can work on your own individual resilience. You can work on things that will calm you down and make you feel more in control of your situation. But ultimately, without the collective unity, it is extremely hard. And what they were recommending is to be as non-confrontational as possible. As we emerge from lockdown, what they are predicting is what they call the honeymoon phase. In there are different phases of emotional reactions and responses during a disaster. It's almost like the phases of grief. And we have been most of us have been in the honeymoon phase while in lockdown. Like we get out and we cheer at 7 o'clock and we're really connecting with people for those, end of the evening cocktails and whatnot. That's all coming to the end as we emerge from our homes and as we emerge from lockdown. And what these disaster psychologists are predicting is far more social confrontation. So to answer your question, to work on it on a collective level, to be antagonistic towards people, let's say over the mask question, it's probably very unhelpful when it comes to collective societal resilience. Then in other words, you've got your own belief system, either I should be wearing a mask or I shouldn't. When you go out, if you start confronting somebody with an opposite, with an opposite belief system, it's going to erode whatever fabric we have of collective unity. And this collective unity, what these disaster psychologists are predicting, is going to erode really, really quickly in our next phase. Because the phase after the honeymoon in the disaster emotions is the disillusionment, the sense of betrayal, the sense of distrust of authority and anger. And so if we're entering that phase, we have to be all the more cognizant of being tolerant and avoiding confrontation. So that's the prescription they're giving. So yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question because I've been thinking about this all day as I've been speaking to these people. And it's harder said than done. I mean, what it really involves is being excessively tolerant when somebody says something absolutely stupid. And to try to amplify messages of sanity and facts when I think you have to know when to amplify it or not. I mean, we can do our best as journalists to try to inform people, but ultimately when we go out into the street and we encounter some jerk who's not wearing a mask and is smoking in your face, think about how to temper your reaction. And I think as we enter this phase, I think leaving lockdown, it's got to be a very gradual thing. I don't think jumping right into the way life used to be is the right way to do it. I think one has to take a fairly Zen, almost Buddhist, this is the way it is approach. But I think, I don't think I have an answer to this, nor do these psychologists, because we are in a highly polarized society where that polarity has been emphasized by the leadership, the federal leadership. And I think it makes it, it's been manipulated. The other thing about resilience is, and again, this gets back to the theme of the book, which is worst case scenario and preparation. If you are aware of the fact that as soon as lockdown ends, life could enter at another level of tension and that you may be experiencing even more anxiety than you did when you were in the cocoon of your home. If you're aware of that, it's going to be easier to deal with it. So again, that's where anticipation and preparation comes in. If you're aware of the fact it's not really, we're all looking forward to getting out of the house, but it's actually has a lot of anxiety producing byproducts. If you're aware of that, and you try to think of mitigating it, again, a big part of the book is doing a risk assessment. What is the possibility of the risk and how do I deal with it? Well, start doing your risk assessment now for when lockdown eases. What is the actual risk of contracting the disease? What is the actual risk of a second round? How are you and your family going to cope with it? And again, if you have a plan for it, you're going to be less anxious. And then that leads to greater resilience.
These are such rich ideas, and I haven't even thought about the post-honeymoon phase. I
Yeah.
And wow, if this is the honeymoon, I'm I'm a little bit nervous about what comes next. But
But
I
you're
don't
gonna be
mean that
prepared. Sewell, you're going to be prepared, so it's not going to be bad.
because I've read the book. Um, a couple more questions before we go to the audience,
Yeah.
to our fellow alums. I'm curious, Judith, and this goes a little bit beyond the book, but you've covered societies where the kind of underlying unity and cohesion or even sense of national identity or collective purpose are themselves either have been challenged or frayed, don't exist, or have grossly deteriorated. I think as Americans, I mean, I don't want to generalize for others, but I think a lot of us in the last few years have, asked fresh questions about what is our own, how stable, how resilient, how robust is our own kind of American social fabric. Could you reflect on that a little bit? It is an incredibly divisive time. It's
Yeah.
an incredibly polarized time.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, conflicts that would have once seemed like things that only happen abroad. You've suggested in this very conversation that you think, unfortunately, civil unrest is likelier than not to kind of rise in America. And could you just reflect on that a little bit? Is it, is it the kind of the world coming to us? How do you contextualize that?
Yeah, I mean, I always think of the great men in history. Look at Hitler, look at Jonas Savimbi in Angola, I mean, I think Trump embodied a certain movement in this country, a certain mood, but he certainly has wrought incredible destruction on our institutions and our belief systems and our social cohesion. But I don't think we're actually at the point where we're a basket case like Russia or Venezuela or Somalia. I mean, I do think that if there is a shift in leadership in November, we can start to reinforce a lot of institutions and whatnot. But I do think this has been a moment, a great revelatory moment, in that I think it is the end of American exceptionalism, without a doubt. We always thought we were immune to this kind of institutional and collective fraying, but I don't think we're at the point of no return. And I do really, I mean, look at New York. We've had exceptional leadership from Cuomo, not a man who I ever admired before, but, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you've gotten really good leadership in California. And I think good leadership can do an immense job in terms of bringing people together and calming a lot of fraught nerves. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but California and New York, despite having a large Democratic base, have not had that level of protest that you've seen in other areas where there has been Republican leadership. And I think leadership is all the key. So, let's not write everything off until November, and let's hope. But I do, yeah, I mean, maybe we had it coming. I mean, all empires fail at some point, don't they? And, we've had a jolt, but I think there is ground that could be regained. We still have a judicial system, we still have a tripartite political system. It hasn't completely fallen apart yet.
We still have a Republican form of government, as if we fight to keep it, right?
Yeah, if we do.
As Jefferson as Franklin warned. I wanted to ask one final question before I turn to the alums. And that is, coming off the last question, a question about inequality. I think it seems the pandemic has exposed so much of what's unequal in our society. And unfortunately, New York is not exempt from that. We know that, it's a city where certain neighborhoods have been hit harder than others because of, demographics or socioeconomic status. We also know that many New Yorkers have had the luxury or the privilege of being able to go to places in the country. I mean, that map in the New York Times showing where New Yorkers have had their mail forwarded to was absolutely fascinating. I think LA was number 4 on that list, So even in an age when people aren't flying, actually could you talk a little about, managing risk and about how does inequality feed the risk that we face as a society?
Yeah, I mean, my sister runs a community center. It's in the projects near Lincoln Center. And the death rate amongst her staff and their families has been immense. because they're lower income, they're living crowding in very small apartments. They don't have access to the teledoctoring, the telemedicine that richer people can have. They just don't have access to those kind of resources, and they don't have the luxury of space. And yeah, no, I think it's a very, very big problem. And getting back to the question of collective resilience, if we can all extend the element of the honeymoon phase, which is caring for people who have less than us, we have a hope. And what I'm afraid of is as we get out of the honeymoon phase, people won't think about those, you know, the old lady next door who needs help with food. Landlords may not think about their tenants who need a break in the rent. This is what I'm worried about. But if at least we can, as individuals, keep that within our sight and make that part of our plan for the next year to help better the situation of other people who have been even more marginalized during this, then I have a hope for our society. And, you know, it's hard because when you get out of the honeymoon phase, according to, you know, the disaster graph, that's when people start looking towards themselves and they start losing those social bonds and that sense of community. But I think it's something that we have to remind ourselves to hold on to. But yeah, I mean, it's very, very scary. We have no social net. We have absolutely no social net. And again, that's where I hope there will be some change of leadership. I think we all hope for that, don't we? Yeah.
I would like to invite the alumni and alumni to weigh in with questions. Eniko, what's the best way to do that? Should people drop the questions into the chat or?
Yeah, I asked people to post their questions in the chat. I didn't see any questions, and I asked it on Facebook as well, and there are no questions on Facebook. So people could either write, or if they raise their hands, I can unmute them, or they can also unmute themselves.
Well, I have a question to pass time until more questions come in, because I don't think we'll have a shortage. Judith, what is the top safety tip you learned from your years at Hunter College High School?
Well, you know, it was the 70s, and my sister, Indra Avens, and Helene Kreischer took the Q28 bus to Flushing Main Street. And then we hoped that we got an express train to Grand Central. We were at 466 Lexington Avenue. So we were traveling about 3 hours a day round trip to go to this excellent public school because our parents couldn't afford anything better. And we used to have a lot of molesters on the train. And during that time, people were being pushed into the tracks. So the safety tip I learned then was safety in numbers. You don't go out alone. You always have somebody to watch your back. And also always carry an umbrella if you can. Because if some guy pulls out his prick, you like whack him with the umbrella. And those extendable umbrellas were very useful. We used to love that. I can't tell you how many gropey men were on the 7 train in those days. And the other thing that I learned was that you should have friends in Manhattan, because if you have friends in Manhattan, then you can sleep over. So I always had a toothbrush. I was always prepared. I always had a toothbrush and a fresh pair of underwear in my backpack. It wasn't a backpack. It was like one of those shoulder bags. I don't think we had backpacks in those days, because you just never knew if somebody would invite you to sleep over, and then you didn't have to make that awful trek back to Queens. Those are my safety tips from the 70s. And my mother always taught me, you stand really far back from the edge of the platform so nobody pushes you in. And smiling, yeah, Anne was a number 7 train person. What was your train, Sewell?
I was also on the 7. I eventually moved to the F because my family was in Bayside. But I also grew up in Flushing, Queens, and my mother always told me to stay away from the edge of the tracks.
There you go.
So there's a lot of wisdom there.
Yeah. And I always carried food for the homeless. I don't know. My mother always said, be nice to people. She's a social worker. It's like, if you're not going to eat your lunch, don't throw it away. Give it to somebody who might eat it. So, but that's not a safety tip. That was just a nice mom tip. Yeah. Yeah. 70s were crazy, weren't they? Oh my God. And sometimes I think that my tolerance for risk came from growing up in the 1070s. Sometimes I wonder about that. Yeah, I remember there was one summer, it was the summer, I was just back from college for the summer. I was working at Baskin and Robbins in Grand Central Station, working the night shift. And that was the summer that Son of Sam was going around gunning people. And it looked like there was a pattern that he was going for a young woman with brunette hair. And I was getting off my shift at like 11 o'clock at night. And I remember my dad, my poor dad, the man of the great sense of humor, would wait for me to pick me up at the Q28 bus stop so that I wouldn't have to walk alone and be killed by Son of Sam. You know, so I think that teaches you to kind of tolerate risk, because you just, and again, we were always doing a risk assessment. What is the likelihood that Son of Sam might get me? You know, should I wear a hat? You know, like, should I not be out at 11? So anyway.
Sorry to age myself, but I was born during the summer of Sam, summer of 77. Don't remember it, but I probably, you know, emerged during this climate of fear. I was recently watching this Netflix series, Trial by Media, which is about kind of revisiting major criminal trials in terms of how they were litigated in part in the press, which is a really interesting subject. Anyway, episode 2 is about the Bernie Getz trial in, you know, following the subway shooting in 1984. And it's just absolutely fascinating and very, very reminiscent of a certain era of the 70s and 80s that I think a lot of us remember still. We're starting to see a flood of questions. I wanted to maybe start with one. Eniko, I'm having trouble reading off of my screen. Do you want to, oh, here we go. From Martha Hodes, the historian. You've advised us to be prepared. How shall we do that when no one knows what will happen next with COVID?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, but we can prepare for what we think might happen. So again, that refers back to what Sewell was saying about the need for very, very good scientifically based information. There are some predictions that we might see another wave of the virus in the fall. So prepare for it now. If you felt you weren't prepared in January, February, March, do all the things now that you didn't then. So for instance, don't let your supplies run down, stock them up now. So then if it does happen, you don't have to worry about going out and buying bales of toilet paper because you already have it in your house. That would be one thing. And also use it as a time, use this time as a way to reflect how you reacted to this, what helped you cope with this emergency, and what worked for you and what didn't. Because the thing about safety training that we do is that it's incremental. Once you've been in one situation, you have lessons that you can draw away for the next situation. The other thing, being a New Yorker, I think you should be prepared. I don't mean to freak everybody out, but we are due for an earthquake, not on the LA terms, but we are due for an earthquake here. Think about what you would do in the case of an earthquake. And we'll probably get another, crazy hurricane like Sandy. So just put all those preparations in place now. Think about where the shelters are near your house. Think about what kind of equipment you need. Think about where you are situated in the city. Here in Harlem, I'm at the highest point in the city. So I'm not going to be as vulnerable as Battery Park in terms of a hurricane. But, Martha, I don't know where you're based, but perhaps you're at a lower point in the city. So really think those things through. Another thing is get all your documents, your emergency documents in order. God forbid if anything happens, just have all your emergency contacts, a copy of your will, your wedding certificate, birth certificate, whatever. Just have them all ready right there. So in case for whatever reason, something terrible happens, you've got everything in one place and you don't have to rush around and look for it. So those are a few things. But again, information is power. Just keep looking at these advisories from the CDC and reliable authorities, because that will give you a sense as to whether this thing is coming back or not. Does that answer?
A question from another.
Yeah.
A question from another alum. Isn't adequate prep like preparing for a hurricane, a blackout, or a snowstorm? I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think it's asking about those kinds of natural events and preparing for them sort of adequate preparation for other kinds of disasters.
Well, even each natural disaster is different. The way Sewell would prepare for wildfire would be different than the way we would prepare for Hurricane Sandy. So again, that's something, and it's all in the book. Like if you're worried about volcanoes, I got them in there too, and tsunamis. It's geographically determined. Having said that, do you remember a few years ago, there was a freak tornado in Brooklyn where my sister lives in Sunset Park? It like blew off the roofs of all these buildings. So, I think it's really, really, really important that we should all be very aware of climate change and how it's changing, because, I was not prepared for that tornado, nor was my sister. But believe me, I will be next time, because now I know that they can hit the Northeast. So yeah, I mean, each disaster has its own peculiarities, but look at the science and see how likely it is to hit the neighborhood near you.
Do you think New York is more resilient than other cities? I'm just reflecting on the kind of, like the kind of disasters within our own, recent memory, from Hurricane Gloria in
Yeah.
1985 to obviously 9/11,
Yeah.
the 2003 citywide blackout, and the 1977 blackout before it, and the 1965 blackout before that. I think I got that year right. Was it 65? I might, okay. Then you think about Hurricane Sandy, of course, in 2012, and now this. Do you think that New Yorkers are a more resilient bunch than other folks?
I will say certainly my family. Oh, I'm hearing the pot banging right now. This is my favorite time of day. Yay. My neighborhood in particular, it's largely Dominican, and it's Dominican and Mexican. And these are folks who deal with hurricanes all the time. They've dealt with, Mexico. Most of the people in my neighborhood have escaped the violence back in their country. These are extraordinarily resilient people who are able to survive. They've survived many tragedies already and much hardship. So I would say certainly in my neighborhood, the people are incredibly resilient. I think New Yorkers generally are. I think we're a city of immigrants, and people have come from areas, they escaped from other areas. My grandparents escaped from the pogroms in Russia, and they lived with us, and it influenced me because, boy, did they have it tough, and they were saving every button and every little scrap and stuff. So I think a lot of New Yorkers are resilient, and I think the more of these things you live through, the more resilient you become. So I think for people who are old enough to have lived through these various blackouts and 9/11 and the hurricanes and whatnot, each one builds a certain degree of resilience. And I think we can take hope from that fact moving forward out of this particular crisis, that ultimately you will come out stronger. You will have come out learning how to deal with a particular adversity. Humans are really, really adaptable. So yeah, it's a long-winded way of saying that I think, a lot of New Yorkers are very resilient. And I'm struck by the humor of people. I remember when people first started going out with masks, just the insane things people put on their faces. I don't know if it's like that in LA. My cousin was walking around with a bra, his wife's bra on his face, and people are painting smiles. Insane. New Yorkers, they have a gallows sense of humor, this is a New York book, gallows.
Yeah, it really is. One Hunterite, Emily Agri, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, asks, there are social theorists who think that unrest after the pandemic will be a class war. Apparently after earlier plagues, like maybe those in the 19th century, wages went up for unskilled workers because they demanded compensation related to their newly rediscovered value to society. Could this happen in our current world with the polarization and inequality? That's a great question. Wow.
It's a great question. I think I have to defer to Martha and one of the other historians. I'm not a very deep, wide thinker. I think we are in for some social changes at the moment, but I can't predict how they're going to take shape. And I think so much depends on the leadership, the national leadership that will take power after the elections in November. I think that will really be a better indicator of what direction we're going into. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that, but I think we are in for some very, very deep social divisions in the months to come, without a doubt. But how it manifests itself and how the authorities react, I don't know. I don't know. What do you think, Sewell? What do you think?
Oh, it's such a big question. There was a whole book, was it by Walter Scheidel, talking about how inequality throughout in modern history tends not to really go down unless there really something calamitous happens. And, I think this, goes off of the kind of, Thomas Piketty research about kind of wealth accumulation. And, I think, one of the strongest arguments for reducing inequality, other than the fact that it's the right thing to do and that it enhances social mobility and equality of opportunity, which I think are Hunter values. I think another argument, though, is also it promotes social stability in the long run. Yeah. This is just me speaking here, but highly unequal societies, I think, are less stable societies. And, part of, the greatness of the American dream, and not to be all corny here, but I do think it goes back to, Thomas Hunter and the immigrant young people, young women that he set up his normal school to advance was this idea of mobility and opportunity. I mean, you had so many people especially in the first century of Hunter's existence, so many girls from immigrant families, from poor families, from Catholic, Jewish, Irish, Italian families, African American, who were part of the great creation of an American middle class in New York City and elsewhere. And I think that's one of the things Hunter stands for, frankly, that it is a place that has propelled people, into places of opportunity. And we need many more schools like it. I hope, Anne, that you don't mind my putting in that shameless plug for our school, but it is one reason why Hunter is so important to me.
Yeah. It was an extraordinary place to be educated. I don't know what it's like now, but it was certainly in the 70s, it was an extraordinary place.
What advice?
And the fact that it was all female when it was also was, and I think in Martha and all, it gave us a sense of possibility that we might not have had otherwise.
Yeah, I think it is still a joyful elite. I'm certainly very lucky that I was able to go there. But I think that the fact that it's a school that has cultivated female leadership throughout its entire history, that I hope has left an imprint on everyone who goes through its doors, even now in the co-ed era. One question before we go to if I can just sneak in one more question while the alumni are asking. What advice would you give to, someone who's at Hunter right now, a young person who's graduating into one of the most uncertain periods in our economy and in, our modern history, a period that even makes the 2007 to 2009 Great Recession seem, relatively tolerable compared to the uncertainty going on right now?
It's a discussion that I have every night with my son, who's 19. He just finished his freshman year in his bedroom. Try not, here I am saying, prepare for the worst case scenario when it comes to disaster or violence. Don't despair just yet. I think try to set very achievable goals in the short term and don't project too much into the future, because we really don't know how things are going to shake out. They look really, really awful on May 20th, 2020, but they may not look so awful in 2 years. So I think try to not think about the worst case scenario when it comes to your career and paying off your student loans or whatever it might be. The other thing which I think is really, really critical, and this was something that has sort of shaped my career, which has been very atraditional in a lot of ways, which is never turn down any opportunity. So if you are offered a job in an ice cream shop and that's all you can get, take it. If you want to be a writer, take that experience in the ice cream shop and write about it. But I think this is a time of great humility where we're going to be lucky to have any opportunities and see anything that comes your way as an opportunity. The other thing, what I'm really hoping comes out of this is a renewed valuation of blue collar work. And I think, particularly in Hunter, we were all driven to a very white collar set of mind, and we all wanted jobs that were in offices and whatnot. But I think more than anything now, I'm really hoping that we return to a time when people really valued what people made with their hands, what people did in factories, gardening and whatnot, because I think, these may be where the opportunities lie, and these are the sort of jobs that keep a society going. And I think one thing that this crisis has taught us with health workers and delivery men, people are doing jobs that we generally don't acknowledge. And I think we need to have a greater sense of that as we plan our own futures coming forward and look at dignity in that. And be really, really kind to people, again, getting back to that collective resilience, and think about what you can do to make this a better society, be it volunteering for an organization or working for an NGO or creating a startup that could make an impact on other people's lives. But, I think this is the time to be looking at collective action. So these are very lofty goals, and don't lose hope, really don't lose hope. Think about World War II. It was a really grim time, and then it ended. I mean, things are temporary. Nothing is permanent. I
Yeah,
hope
those
that's
are really, really,
inspirational to your kids, but if
no,
not, tell them
that's
don't talk
super
to
wise. That's super wise. And I think, I mean, if I can reflect for a moment, I think, Hunter is, such a cerebral place. We all went there because we were gifted and talented kids and did well in testing and all that. And we got great opportunities out of it. But I think, looking back, we have to, I feel, just speaking for myself, I reflect on what, the notion of meritocracy really means. The majority of our adults and the majority of our society don't go to, are not graduates of four-year universities, and certainly not the kind of highly selective four-year, universities that Hunter kids tend to go to. And that's no knock on being smart and being gifted and being cerebral. But it also, I think, but it does speak to your point, Judith, about valuing different kinds of work in our society, valuing work that is not always necessarily compensated, like the emotional work and the caring work. I mean, the amount of work that has gone into the multiple jobs that people have taken on to care for people of other generations, including elderly, including disabled relatives, and of course, children. That's really, really a key aspect of our times, I think.
Yeah. This has been a very philosophical discussion. It's wonderful. Thank you, Sewell. Really good questions.
I'm happy to keep going. I am waiting for
I am
more
too.
questions. Yeah, I'm waiting for more questions from our audience. Please don't be shy.
So I'm wondering, I'm going to ask you some questions if I may, because I'm a journalist, so I can't shut up. What are the major issues that you're looking at in the major cultural or political shifts or societal shifts that you're looking at in the months to come?
Well, that's a good, thank you. I mean, one reason I wanted to live in California and have this experience in the West Coast. And we recently, by the way, had a Hunter class reunion, and maybe a good quarter of us are on the West Coast now from my class. But it's a different outlook on society. I think we're moving toward a more Pacific-oriented century, perhaps a more Pacific-oriented time. Los Angeles is definitely closer, kind of just in terms of culturally, but also in terms of economically, to Latin America and Asia. And I think it's, at the forefront of some of the changes in our society in terms of the rising, Latino electorate and some of the political changes, but also in terms of, being closer to kind of some of the geopolitical changes going on in the world as the US, moves into a more kind of multipolar world. So I'm interested in seeing how that is affected in terms of the elections. California is a very dynamic place. Orange County, which was the birthplace of so much of the modern Republican movement and was very much Reagan country in the 80s, recently swung in the midterm elections for the first time to be an entirely Democratic delegation from Orange County, which is really the home of the kind of anti-tax movement. So things are changing here dynamically. It's very much a Democratic dominated government. I'm not, I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to be nonpartisan. I'm not sure that's always a good thing. You want some degree of kind of, give and take. But I do think that California has become really a progressive leader on many issues, from environmental and emissions to privacy. So that's one thing that interests me a lot about the future of progressive governance, the future of the liberal idea in America and how it's expressed here. I'm pretty worried about the election. I'm worried about the electoral integrity questions, not just the misinformation and disinformation online and its spread, but also active efforts to interfere with the election. I've been very troubled, and this is just, something I'm interested in. I'd be curious about what other Hunter alums' points of view are. But, the whole, controversy over mail-in balloting seems so strange to me, because it really shouldn't be a partisan issue, and there's not clear evidence which side has helped. There are a lot of people, among Trump's voters, I think, who would probably benefit from mail-in balloting, whether or not because they have underlying health conditions or just the trouble of getting to the polls. I'm not sure why that issue has become, like so many other issues, hyper polarized. To me, mail-in balloting is something that would actually, make it easier to vote, and that maybe isn't such a bad thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
A question from a classmate named Alex. It's from a schoolmate named Alex. It sounds like personal preparedness depends a lot on having the means, mental, physical, financial, to make long-term plans and stockpile. What do you think are ways for us as a society to build preparedness to be able to account for those who may not have the personal resources to do that kind of work? Great question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You really hit upon something very, very important there, that to a certain extent preparedness is a luxury. However, if you look at Puerto Rico, where my brother-in-law is from, in villages, for instance, the village he's from, Rio Grande, everybody will get together and they will maybe buy a generator together. So there will be collective resources for people. If somebody loses their home, the others take them in. And those who have will help those who don't. And that's something that can be achieved in a very, very small community, like a village or a hamlet. But maybe what we need to do is build more villages in our big cities right now. And the one thing that really has come out of this crisis for many people is they've gotten to know their neighbors. And maybe, you know, as we leave the honeymoon phase of the disaster, maybe that's one thing that we need to hold on to. But I think you've got to look out for other people here. I think part of your preparedness is thinking about who you can take care of and who you have the means to help. And again, come up with a specific plan. If you can only help 2 people, it's still extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, you're still
That's a really meaningful answer. I mean, I think a lot about inequality, and I think that's part of the equation, but it's not just a question of money. It's also about the collective ethos, about the willingness to be kind to the stranger. And you know, resilience is not just a question of income, because if it were, you know, folks in Puerto Rico would not have weathered, you know, the crisis there the way they have. So that's really profound. Emily asks, I think every time I try to get my papers together, I find something else to do. I think that's true of probably all of us, many of us. I think I need to gather what would be needed if I had to go to the hospital. Any ideas of what to prepare? Yeah.
Do you have a living will? Do you have somebody who's your health proxy? You want that with you. You definitely, particularly now that it's very hard for relatives to go to the hospital and be your advocate, you need those documents with you. Do you have telephone numbers that you can give the doctor of all the people that you would want to be contacted in an emergency? Let's say, you know, so I think those are 2 critical things. What about your insurance documents? You definitely need those with you. But more importantly, I would say I have an 88-year-old. She likes to say she's 87, but she's actually 88. An 88-year-old second cousin who is she's still working as an immigration lawyer. When all this happened, she named me as her health proxy. She redid her will. She redid her living will. And she gave all my contact information to her lawyer and the executor of her will. And that's something that, you know, I think, you know, at first she was like, oh my God, I don't want to think about my death. But it was like hanging over her because all she was thinking about was her death. So then she took some action, which is kind of the theme of this thing. And she just felt a lot better because, like, if she dies, it's all in place and she knows the money will go to the right people and whatever. So that's one way. I don't know if this is helpful, but I think those are the kind of documents that you want to have with you.
Super helpful. And just to read off from the chat, Nan Weissman is suggesting a healthcare proxy, HIPAA authorization, living will, durable power of attorney. Virginia Tang says, Google 25 documents you need before you die in order to organize all the necessary materials, which I think is probably good advice.
Yeah. I mean, it's a real drag to confront that stuff. My husband and I just redid our wills and we were like, oh, I don't want to do it today. We finally did it. And now we did it. We don't have to worry about it anymore. So just do it.
Yeah, it's good for peace of mind too. Karen Katz has a question. What can we do about the prevalence of misinformation on cable news and online?
Unfortunately, and I think Sewell is probably in a better position to answer this than myself, there are news silos. And I don't know how you combat another silo. You can only combat what's in your own orbit, and you can try to share the proper information with those who you have contact with. I mean, I don't know, Sewell, do you have the magic bullet for this? I don't know. As long as Facebook does not take some responsibility for the dissemination of highly irresponsible information, I don't know what we can do individually. I know for a fact, I just don't tune into stuff that gets me very upset. I used to read Breitbart and I used to watch Fox, and I just can't at the moment. I have enough going on with this pandemic. I don't know, Sewell, I think you're in a better position than myself to talk about how to combat it. I mean, it has to be done at a higher level, other than your individual interactions that you have with people.
There are a lot of efforts around news literacy and media literacy, which I think are important because ultimately it is about education. I think about, you know, what we learned at Hunter in terms of, you know, we were learning about how to use trusted sources of information. I mean, my goodness, we were taught about like how to use the library card catalog, how to find primary sources. I mean, like literally some of the things that we learned in 7th and 8th grade, yes, with Mrs. Eichler are absolutely relevant today. You know, we were told to look at primary source materials. You know, we were taught how to verify and how to do research. And I think sometimes maybe that part is weakened a little bit in an age when some young people may believe that all knowledge is to be found online. And of course, that's a very dangerous assumption because so much of human knowledge has not been digitized. So much truthful and accurate information isn't online. And so, you know, getting people to really think more carefully about sources of trust and is very important. I also think we in the media have to do a much better job of being humble, being transparent about our methods, being, you know, absolutely faithful to the facts and publish corrections and frankly, you know, repent if we make errors. You know, this is not a time for arrogance or complacency. And I think we in the media kind of really need to not give, you know, those who would level accusations of fake news any material to make those accusations. And those are some of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great thoughts. Great thoughts.
Finally, I think we're nearing the end here. Nina Spiro asks, any comments on the book and website, Get Your Shit Together?
I don't think I know that website, Get Your Shit Together, but it sounds like something I need to read.
Nina, do you want to tell us more? I
yeah,
don't know
I'm
this.
intrigued. I'm like ready to sign on right now. What is it?
Wait here, we can unmute her. Nina, you're unmuted. Oh, I'm trying to unmute you.
Oh, no, here,
There.
I'm unmuted.
Hi, Nina.
Hi there, this is fantastic. Sorry, I'm moving around my house, which is why I don't want to be a distracting visual. So that book, Get Your Shit Together, was written, I haven't read it yet, I've read about it. It was written by a woman whose husband was tragically killed on his bike on the way to work or on the way home in a car crash. And she got the call, he's dead, come. And she didn't have the code to his phone. They didn't have a will. They didn't have.
Oh my God. Get your shit together.
So she, out of this tragedy, she wrote a book and has a website, and it's literally called Get Your Shit Together. And I just thought it might be of interest to us and to you.
All right, thank you for sharing this. I am going, as soon as we get off this call, I'm going to pour myself a glass of wine and read about this. This sounds philosophically very similar to what I believe in. This is, and she got her shit together. That's great.
Exactly, and I guess she's helping others to do the same.
Wonderful.
And now, having listened to you, I will look at your book and hers. I promise.
Bookended.
On
Yeah,
that note,
thank you for attentioning me to that. This is really helpful. Yeah.
So before we
One more.
unmute everyone.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Masha, I should have asked this and I apologize. Can I ask this? Masha Fontes asks, Judith, would you give us the pleasure of reading a teaser bit from the book? And I'm so sorry to everyone. I probably should have begun with that question and I apologize.
Okay. Just, I'm going to have to, here we go. Just give me a second.
Yep.
I had a couple little snippets prepared. Now I have to look for them.
Well, while Judith is looking for them, just note that if you go to her website, go to the book page, there are 5 different links, places where you can buy the book. The first 3 of which would be a hard copy, and then you can get an autographed book plate, which she will send to you if you email her at judith@judithmatloff.com. And those 2 links are in the chat bar.
Now, Anne, my question for you, Anne, is when are we going to have Elena Kagan here answering questions?
Yes.
Well, I've put in a request. I'm not sure that I'm going to get an answer. I think she might be busy, but trying to hold the country together.
Is her brother Irving still at the school?
He is, and I actually sent him a message and I sent her a letter. So
yeah,
I'll keep you posted if
it's
anything.
a tall order. I don't think anyone will judge you if she's too busy, but
right. I said that in my letter.
What an amazing community.
There's also another alumni working on that in DC, because we were trying to organize a visit, an actual physical visit as well. So maybe from the two channels we meet somewhere, maybe.
And did you all see the Q&A recently with Cynthia Ozick? That was just incredible. My gosh, just an incredible person.
I mean, think about our community. I mean, it's just been such a rich collection of individuals. You know, Hunter is special. It's special.
Okay, give us a reading, Judith.
Okay. Do you want to hear about vodka showers, tsunamis, disaster dining, severed parts, nuclear catastrophe? Any special requests?
Well, Nancy Weissman.
What's that? What's that?
Dining.
And anything specific? Okay.
Nan Weissman said vodka.
The vodka shower, I really, okay. I tried this technique in various bath challenge situations, including once when the city shut off the water on my street in Manhattan. My hair follicles never looked healthier, and the acne from not showering dried up. My skin had a shine derived not from sweat, but deeply clean pores. In place of vodka, one can substitute gin, tequila, whiskey, brandy, grappa. You get the idea. I prefer clear spirits because they resemble water. Anybody interested in tsunamis? I mean, you live on the West Coast. Okay, I'll bring it on. Tsunamis. Red flags include a sharp rise in coastal waters and an ocean roar resembling the sound of a jet engine. Follow the animal's cue. If they start racing to higher ground inland, so should you. Also be on high alert if the sea or the ocean suddenly recedes dramatically from the shore. This is not the time to hunt for conch shells newly exposed. Hundreds of fish lapping on wet sand is the cue to flee to more elevated ground, preferably 2 miles inward or 100 feet above sea level. Failing that, climb a tree and hug it tightly, whether or not you're an environmental activist. Praying can't hurt. Any other?
Why don't we do the severed parts? That's
severed parts. That's always a winner. People love that one. Oh, and there's a great drawing in the book of a manicured finger in a Ziploc bag. Again, you'll enjoy it. Okay, severed parts. Let me just look, where did I put the severed part? Hold on, maybe it got severed. People like to keep their severed parts with them. Makes them feel safer knowing their limb or digit is right nearby. If yours or someone else's fingers have just gotten cut off, store them in a Ziploc bag. Same goes for spilled intestines. Keep them moist and cool, but not drenched. Transport the sealed bag in a chilled container. Make sure there's no ice in the Ziploc bags. A finger is not an oyster. Ice damages tissue. So, you know, when you're trying out all these new recipes in, you know, these new pandemic, lockdown recipes, if your finger gets cut off, now you know what to do.
And finally, Emily Rosenberg asks, is the body in the title dead or alive?
Oh, it's alive. I'll read that to you. That's actually a very big part of my training. It's to, let's say you're at the scene of a car accident and the first responders haven't arrived yet, and you need to get the person out of traffic. It's that type of scenario. Or let's say there's been a mass shooting at a concert. And again, the first responders haven't gotten there, and you want to get the person outside of the line of fire and also not stampeded. It's that type of scenario, which unfortunately I have faced on many occasions. So, how to drag a body. Wait until first responders arrive, because moving an injured person the wrong way can paralyze them or worsen whatever damage they've suffered, be it the spine, bones, or brain. However, if it looks like the emergency workers aren't arriving anytime soon, and the victim appears to be facing fatal injury, it's better to take action. Shift them into as flat a position as possible, pulling the shirt above the shoulders on both sides of the head to prevent the head from rolling. If the victim is vomiting or choking on blood, roll them on their side with the help of someone else to prevent bending the neck and body. Make sure to stabilize them. There you go. Now you know how to do it. And you want to practice this. I mean, when we do the training, it takes a good full hour till somebody can drag bodies. I have dragged, and I'm pretty tiny, as you all know, I have dragged a 300-pound man who was thrashing about. If I can do it, you can do it. Yeah.
Well,
So,
on that note,
you are the best moderator. What can I say? We have to give him a giant round of applause. You have been so generous with your time, so wise. So I've been in profound admiration of you for so many years, and it's been a real pleasure to meet you right now. It's been a real honor.
Back at you, Judith. I mean, I'm going to recommend this book to all my friends who are my colleagues who are foreign correspondents and work in hazardous situations. You know, there's a very, very serious dimension to this book, but I also think it's actually a book that all of us should read. I've learned a lot from it. There are steps I'm going to take, and I think the sense of kind of both peace of mind and a sense of, you know, being in control, that's wise advice in unpredictable times. That's exactly advice that a prudent Hunter graduate should follow. And I just really, really also want to thank, of course, Anne, and again, Anne, for bringing us together. Really, it's just a wonderful part of to be a part of this community, and it's really wonderful to be taking part in this conversation across time zones and across generations. And that's not something that would have easily happened before this pandemic. So it's one good thing that has come out of this.
Yeah, and Anne has done such an amazing job, and I want to thank Aniko for holding everything together technically, because as she knows, Anne and I are not the most technical people. And I want to thank all of you alums who came out this evening. I know people have better things to do, and it's just so lovely to see familiar faces and meet new ones. You know, community is it's been one of the themes of this evening, and this has been a proof of what we can do and what's so lovely about Hunters. I'm really moved by this. I really am. I mean, I really, really thank all of you for the support for this. So thank you.
So we're gonna unmute you in just a second. There may be a cacophony of sounds, but you could try and like wave and somebody will grab the floor. But there about 20 or more people dropped off, and some of them wrote comments. Tiana Wimmer, Cheryl Rubin, a bunch of others. They had to leave, but Tiana was there taking pictures of the screen with her camera. Helen Feingold-Friedman was here. I think she dropped off too, but and I just shout out, there's so many from our class, 75, 76, which is just so phenomenal. But we also have somebody here from New Zealand, I believe, right? Emily Rosenberg, am I correct? I believe so. Did she drop off? She was here just a minute ago. Anyway, Sewell and Judith, here. Thank you. Oh, good. Here she is from New Zealand, where they don't have COVID.
What time is it there? What time is it?
It's 11:30.
Anyway, thank you, everyone. Let's
Saturday
unmute
morning.
everyone.
Friday
Try
morning.
the book.
Saturday morning. Oh my God.
Friday morning.
Oh, Friday morning.
Friday, Saturday. What's the difference?
You're living in a great country. What can I say?
I know. I wish I could stay longer.
Yeah.
I was supposed to come back in April after I'd been here working for a year, but they automatically extended everybody's visas until the end of September. So I'm planning to stay until they kick me out.
Great place to be. Yeah. Wow.
Can you guys unmute yourselves? You should be able to unmute yourselves if you want to be unmuted.
I unmuted everyone, whoever hasn't muted themselves. So
Okay.
Dangerous thing to unmute a bunch of Hunterites.
Great to see, especially because we're not going to have our reunion this year in person. This is just so meaningful. This is just really powerful to see all these names and faces. This is incredible. I you know, like Sewell, I feel really, really intensely moved by this experience. I mean, Hunter is, I don't know, it kind of made us who we are, isn't it?
Martha, not to put you on the spot, but could you give us a little bit of a historical perspective on some elements of what are going on right now? Again, I don't, I know that historians don't like to make predictions.
No, I'm not all in the prediction business, and I haven't studied the 1918 pandemic. I think another interesting comparison is HIV/AIDS.
Yeah.
And, I actually had a student write a very brief paper for me this semester about comparing the 1918 pandemic, HIV/AIDS, and COVID-19 from the perspective. I had two students work on it. One wrote it from the perspective of young people, and the other wrote it from the perspective of artists. And both were really fascinating.
Well, the advantage is, think that was a horrific time in history when people were dying without a cure, and a cure was found. Not a cure, but a cocktail that could prolong lives. So again, let's not despair fully. Yeah.
I think the only other thing I'd say is, and I've told my students this, is that we're all participants in history now.
Yeah.
And being a participant in history allows us to shape the future if we're
I like that. Okay, we got to tell that to the graduating students as well. Participating in history, make it. I see somebody's head. Is that my sister's
I
head?
think it's your sister.
Yes, it is.
Hi. So now we have,
My sis. Look at her. Hi, sis.
and we have Audrey Roth, also from the class of
Audrey?
73.
Where are
right?
you hiding, Audrey? Oh, there
Thank
you
you,
are. Hi,
Audrey.
honey. Hi. Oh, this is so great. These
And-
people I love who I never see due to the stupid pandemic. Hi, sister.
Yep. Hi. Thank you to Audrey for reminding
Yeah,
me.
hi, Audrey. Hi, sweetie.
Hey.
Well, we spoke on the phone recently.
That's right, we did.
Yeah.
I just want to let you know, Judith, that when I was in 7th grade on what was then the double E train, I don't know what it is now.
Yeah, I know. They had weird names. In it.
There was a guy who grabbed me on a very crowded train, and I picked his hand up and held it over my head and asked if anybody had lost it.
My mother gave me that line when I started taking the subway, that line, or will you please keep your hands to yourself? And when I once lifted someone's hand and said, whose hand is this? And whoever it was grabbed it back and he said, it's not mine. And someone else said, it's not mine.
Yeah, but this harkens back to Sewell's question about how do you train people against assault and harassment? That's actually something we do in our training with women, which is somebody puts their hand, it doesn't belong there, you take the damn thing off.
Right.
And you tell them it doesn't belong there.
Right.
And it's a very effective tool. I remember also, I don't remember doing this, Susan, some guy would be masturbating on the train. We go, ew, what a disgusting penis, look over there. And that usually got, usually they put it away then, yeah. Yeah, we had some good tactics. We also used to carry rape whistles, again, hearkening back to your earlier question, Sewell. We carried rape whistles back in the I just tried it the other day. It's lost its whistle. But, I found it at the bottom of some drawer somewhere. Yeah, the 70s were crazy.
There was a rumor about hat pins when we were in 7th grade.
Oh, yeah.
That's what women did in the old days.
Yeah.
Right.
And people carried mace, which I think is now illegal in a lot of states. But I remember some people did carry mace. I'd be scared to carry that stuff because, somebody could just use it against me. So I usually recommend people don't carry weapons. But of that type, you definitely don't carry a gun. But yeah. Yeah, the 70s are
Apologies for just 1 second. I just want to thank you guys officially because I want to close the Facebook. I'm not closing the Zoom, so feel free to chat, but I want to stop the Facebook projection. So thank you again so much for Sewell, Judith, and Anne for the whole session. And continue talking. I'm just saying goodbye to our Facebook viewers.
I'm afraid I need to hang up as well, but everyone, please be safe, be well, see you soon. Thank you. Thank you, Hunter. Thank you.
Thank you, Sewell.
Thank you, Sewell.
Congratulations, Judith.
Big round of applause. Thank you.
Yay.
Yeah. Is that Arlene Haas I see?
Yeah.
Hi.
You see a lot of people from our class. You see Leslie